So we're ready for another Q&A, and this one comes from Colin. He's asking about the final finish on Danish Oil. He says, I've applied coats, left to dry before sanding and also wet sanded, but the finish I have at the moment is like fine grit on top. What can I do to fix this? I'm suspicious here that what may have happened is the surface may be dry, but it hasn't cured through. And what happens when you put oil, any of the finishes onto a surface, we tend to think it's only water that causes the grain to rise, but other finishes do too. So you put that first coat on, the grain rises and you start sanding, but the finish itself hasn't cured, especially with oils. Oils can take longer than it says on the can. It doesn't do what it says on the can. So you have to go a little bit longer with some of the oils. It depends on how the Danish oil is made. And they're all made differently. There is no industry standard for Danish oil that we know of. So you can call anything Danish oil pretty much. So what I would suggest you do is give it a good sanding, raise the grain first by dampening the surface with a damp cloth. That will raise the grain, and then let that dry, hair dry it if you want to, iron it dry if you want to, but then go in and sand that surface. Apply the first coat of oil and then let that cure probably longer than 24 hours, I would suspect. Go longer and then sand that coat, and then between the coats after that you shouldn't have a problem with grain raising. Make sure it's dust free, don't leave any dust on the surface, don't use dust on your rag. Those kind of things will help you. That's what I think could be happening. You've got raised grain and it's pimply, and then you build up coats on top, and all of those coats start to undulate on the surface. I have a great question here. How do you make a juice groove with a gouge in a cutting board? I made a beautiful cutting board by hand, then made the juice groove with an electric router, but I will not use the electric router again. I think it's a great question. I've got a piece of sapele here. If I was running a groove here, I'll just give a quick demo. Say a juice groove going around here. I'm going to clamp it in the vise. I've got a small gouge handy. So I've got my board marked. It may be different on yours in reality. You have to have a start and stop point. So I'm going to stop mine about here just as an example. A couple of clamps on here. And you can super glue these on as well and then pop them off after. And then just take a gouge like this. So I'm going to cross the grain. And if you're worried about overshooting at this end, you can put a block on here to butt into. But what the best way is going to be get down to the depth like I am now, and then just pop this last bit here into the other extreme, the line there, the guideline. So I'm just getting down to depth, and then I just stab or jab, whichever you want to call it, and go down to whatever depth you want to. So that's perfectly simple. I like the idea. It will have a little undulation. It's going to be a little bit different than, and let me do the other going into it so I can show you where we start and stop. I'm going to go this way this time. It's the same, but the actual cut feels remarkably different than it does going across the grain. And it's just practice. One of the things you must have is a super sharp gouge. And what you do is you ride the bevel of the gouge. So you put this heel of the bevel here goes onto the surface of the wood, and then you rotate this until you get your start cut there. So I'm getting my cut, and I run into the other groove, move back, and this one is going deeper now. And of course you want straight grain stock, but if you do hit rising grain, it's very simple. You just turn around and come from the opposite direction like this. And that's how I would do it. And you do feel like you're in control, as long as your chisel, your gouge is sharp, and then finish off your mitre in the corner. And that's how you create it. I've not gone very deep because not everybody's going to be interested in this, and it would take longer to go deeper, but not much longer. Good sharp chisel, ride the bevel, and then you've got your groove meeting in the corner. That's how I would do my drip groove. This one is from David. I use the same sharpening system as Paul, diamond stones and strop. Does Paul ever regrind his irons and chisels back to 25 degrees? How does he do it? I have a bench grinder but dislike using it. I revert to using sandpaper, but it's slow. My reasons to return to 25 degree is badly out of square irons, and at times I sharpen to too steep an angle. I'm not sure if this is a practical solution, but I find after I regrind I can maintain a nice square 30 degrees convect bevel for much longer. I believe this is muscle memory. Okay. I think the issue with this regrinding is I use a grinder periodically because I have 60 chisels to regrind after students have been here for 9 days, and they do go out of sync a little bit. They're not, the bevels aren't where they should be for the beginning of the next class. So we always start the class with good sharp chisels ready to go. But if I'm doing my own chisels, very rarely do I bring them to the grinder because I maintain that bevel. And I can do it by, yes, muscle memory, just as you mentioned. But if you haven't developed that, there's nothing wrong with using an angle grinder, not an angle grinder, a honing guide like this one. This will hold it, and I don't know why your sandpaper is slow, because sandpaper is not slow, it's actually very fast. So it may be the type of particulate that you have on your sandpaper, aluminium oxide, chromium oxide, whatever particle they use. There'll be different types, and just find one that works fast. And I would go to the course, I would go to even 60 grit. If my chisels were way out, I'd go to 60 grit, then to 80, 120, and so on, just to get the bevels back. But the more you realize that you don't keep honing the cutting edge, you hone the whole bevel. This is not like hollow grind where you keep thickening up the edge and then you have to take a lot off. We're not using grinders, we're not advocating grinders. They're slow and dull for most of our work. We can do it very quickly by hand methods, just the way you're doing it. Just takes practice and the right material. Okay, how would you approach making wooden gears without using power tools? I intend to build a clock based on Clayton Boyer's Model T clock design. Rasps, files, and drill bits. I use the Brad Point drill bits for very accurate work. You can get those from Veritas in Canada. They give excellent spur point bits, the best I've ever used. And if it's that accurate, and then files, drills, and round files, round rasps, things like that will get you where you want to be. So that's what I would do. This one's from Ian, and that one was from Ian too, by the way. Hello, Paul. A different Ian, though. Would you please talk a little bit more about hand resawing? Whenever I try to resaw a thicker and longer piece of wood, my handsaw tends to drift away from my gauge line. Try as I might, I cannot get it back on track. I'm swapping sides every 15 strokes when I bend the saw blade on one side. You know, sometimes you can be trying to force the saw back into the cut, and what you're doing is flexing the plate, and it's actually creating the exact opposite effect to what you want to do, especially if you're kind of a bulldog character where you really want to force this instead of sensing it. You end up using force that's not really necessary. So I suggest that might be it. And if you go into this too heavy-handedly, that's where you will end up. But the problem is it's hard to give a definitive answer because there are so many issues. The saw set slightly being heavier on one side or no set on one side, those kinds of things. Those are the issues. So without handling the saw, it's very different. There could be half a dozen reasons for that. Great. Paul, I was hoping you could explain how to cut dental molding by hand. So far, I can only find information on ways to cut it with a table saw. Thanks. Love your books and videos. Well, dental molding, I only have a tiny piece of wood here, but let me see if I can do a quick impromptu demo. We make a line here. Let's say we want a dentil is going to be a section of wood taken out here at regular intervals like this along the surface, along a long piece of wood. So what we would do perhaps is put a saw kerf across here and a saw kerf across here. Let's see how well we do with this, and I think this will help you. Like this. Like this. Clamp a second piece of wood against this one here. Like this. Make sure it's parallel along here to that depth. Clamp the two in the vise like this, and then use the two guidelines there. Whoops. You'll have to have a depth on it to stop you. And then what you do is you move this over here to that first saw cut. So there, I'm in that first saw cut. We go to this one. Use that as a guideline, like that. And then we nudge it over to this one. And that gives us that parallel, that perfect sizing for each one. And just keep moving across. Then we take a chisel, if we have one, and we take out the section we don't want here. So that comes out like that. And then we move over to the second, move over to the next, move over to the next. And that's how you would make that. So that would work perfectly. Okay. What's your take on the ruler trick for creating a flat surface on a plane blade? Well, it doesn't create a flat surface on a plane blade straight away. What this is, somebody once advocated that to get a plane blade that has a pitted surface or an uneven surface or a bad surface, you put a ruler, which is now called the ruler trick, on one side like this, and you offer your blade to this side. So this flat surface here is no longer flat, but it has a bevel on the opposite side. As you keep going, it will create a wider and wider flat surface. But on most blades, it's just not necessary. For the odd 1 out of 500, 1 out of 1,000 blades that have got deep pitting in that face, it's a great trick to use. But for me, I wouldn't use it generally, but there's nothing wrong with using it for correcting a problem in your plane iron. This one's from Justin, and he's asking, can you show how sharp marking gauge pins should be and how to sharpen them? This is a great question, Justin, because it's quite difficult to sharpen the conical point on hardened steel. And I've got two gauges here. One is where I've resharpened this one, and this is the original pin. And what this one is, just a conical point, like maybe a pencil point out of a pencil sharpener, whereas this one has a chisel point. And I'm going to show you what I do on a piece of steel that's a little bit bigger than a chisel point. I hope I can. And we usually take a flat file like this, and we file this face on one side, a bit like a flat bit you might have in a bradawl. We come from both sides, opposite faces, like this. Until we get that chisel edge like this. So now we've got the bevel on both sides, and actually when it's loaded into the marking gauge, let me get the one I want to show you in here, we orient this flat edge here to the front face here or to the back face of the marking gauge, so that when it runs into the wood like this here, it's a very nice cutting edge in a sense, that gives a very thin line, and I think it's better than the conical point for me, and that's the way we generally sharpen our marking gauges, mortise gauges, any of that type of gauge. Great. Thanks for that question. I think it was great. This is from Chris, and he says, can you explain how to determine how many dovetails to have in a certain width of board? Is there any type of methods we could use to determine this? I understand that I don't want them too thin in something that needs strength and so forth. But I always get stuck on how many to use in any certain widths. For example, I'm making a small box blower. So in this, I think there is no industry standard, even though some might say there is. I haven't found one that really works. So really, I usually go with this. This is my method. If it's 3-inch wide stock, I go with 2 dovetails. If it's 4-inch wide, I go with 3. And then if it goes on to 7 inches wide, I go with 5. And then with 8, I go with 6. So it's 2 stops down, basically. Usually after that, if it's wider than that, I'll go with 1 1/4 dovetails and 3/8 pins. That's my preference. I've found that 3/8 pins give me super strength. If I go too thin on the pins, yes, they look nice, but they don't feel as strong to me. They don't seem to have the resilience that I like. So that's my formula, and it has worked for me for 50 years. And wow, that concludes another questions and answers session, and I really have enjoyed your questions. I've enjoyed looking through my archives and finding the answers for you. So keep looking at our YouTube and follow those, because there's lots and tons of information there that we put together to try to protect and preserve the best of our craft for all the generations yet to come. So thank you very much for following us.